Friends at Lower Canada College. For those who haven't met, my name is Craig Kilberger. I'm the co-founder of Free the Children and wanted to say a huge congratulations on the Global Issues Conference that you're hosting. The world needs you. Environment, poverty, homelessness, war, conflict, terrorism. The list goes on and on. You can pick any issue. And at the root of all these issues are challenges that we face every day to not be passive bystanders, to not simply close our eyes to the suffering in our world, but instead to raise our voice. And that isn't easy. You know, I had an honor to spend time with Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop who won the Nobel Peace Prize for years helping to lead the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the challenge that that generation faced. And he once said, the newspaper every day is an opportunity for us to start a conversation, the headlines that come into our world. And we have a choice. We can either close our eyes, close our hearts, or we can engage as active citizens. And I love that you've made a choice in this conference to engage in these issues. And I want to challenge you not just to have conversations, but to engage in action. What will you do that will change the life of someone in your own backyard or halfway around the world, someone who needs your help? I think young people are the greatest force for good in our world. And in fact, you look at most revolutions or social change, young people have always been at the forefront of many of those great movements. There was young people who marched alongside Gandhi in the famous salt marches of India against colonization. Or it was youth who faced water cannons and attack dogs and sat at the counters in the civil rights movements when they were looking for desegregated schools and voting rights. There was young people who stood in front of tanks in Tiananmen Square. There was young people who were shot as they marched against apartheid in South Africa. It was young people who filled Tahrir Square in Egypt, toppling a government, and youth right now in parts of the world like Kiev and others who are raising their voice for democratic reform. What's your movement? Now, you're not called to stand in front of a tank, thank God, but we are still called to stand. And maybe that's connecting to a sister village around the world, helping provide a school, clean water, or health. Maybe that's helping to raise your voice through an advocacy campaign to look for democratic reforms or freeing a political prisoner. Maybe that's closer to home, choosing to roll up your sleeves and to help a new immigrant to Canada, or to volunteer on an issue close to your own family, your own community. It doesn't matter what it is, but it does matter that you raise your voice. And so I wish you all the best on this conference and for finding your movement and being the change today that the world needs.
Good morning, and thank you to Craig Kilberger for sending that message to us and to you. I think it's an important one. I have the privilege, I've been asked by the organizing committee to say welcome as head of school. Bienvenue à tout le monde pour cette journée spéciale. And I welcome in particular all of our special guests, our delegates, and students. Indeed, I think the challenge to stand and to have an appropriate dialogue today, but also to think about where this will take you is important. This is actually the 15th annual Destiny Quebec conference, so this kind of dialogue has been going on for a long time in our school, and I think amongst our community of schools. So I thank new delegates who have never attended before for being here. I'd also like to congratulate our organizing committee, a number of students. They will be introduced in a moment, but in particular, Juliana Kiefler-Johnson and Eric Schwartz, who've worked very hard to make sure that we indeed could all be gathered here this morning. The topic of globalization, I think, for young people is very difficult. It is in some ways very abstract, and how do you get your teeth into it? And I think that we began by a few of ideas from Mr. Kilberger about what it is you can do, but do something. I've always found in the last number of years that this is indeed a new imperative, and I just talk about 3 Ps. One is the movements across borders of products. We're all familiar with that. Trade, obviously, and different trade patterns. Migration, people, and the movement of people, significant in our age. And the third P might be philosophy, and the shifting norms of different philosophies from different corners of the world, really migrating all around the world is, as we all know, and we're right into an election campaign which is talking about it here in Quebec, is a challenge in practice. So all that said, there's much to discuss today. I congratulate you for being here. I thank the organizing team. There are a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities, But as Mr. Kielburger said, if indeed youth does not stand up and be counted and feel that these are your issues, then we're in deep trouble. So I invite you to do that. I ask you to enjoy your conversations today, and I would ask that Mr. Piotto, who is our faculty advisor to the group, come forward et peut-être il peut expliquer exactement ce qu'on va faire ce matin and give us a few details around the specifics of the day. So Mr. Piotto, please come on up.
As Mr. Shannon told you, this is our 15th annual DQ conference. I've been around for 9 of them. And as a matter of fact, this is the largest organizing committee we've ever had. We have about 20 students on our DQ executive. It really has been an honor for me to work with the DQ executive. We work once a week. They are incredibly dedicated. They're very imaginative. And they've taken a great deal of control. The issue that we're discussing today is the issue that they wanted to discuss. The seminar topics that we've broken down in today are seminar topics that they felt would be relevant to all the delegates here today. So I want to thank them for all their work. We also have another committee, a larger committee of students that meets roughly once a month every Thursday morning. The vast majority of those students are in grade 10. They have done a wonderful job as well, and I hope that they're going to be leaders coming forth for next year, because it's very important. The leadership that we've had in the committee has been exceptional over the years. I just want to thank, we have a number of organizing staff who are here as well. Ms. Leader and Mr. Soré, thank you very much for all your work with the committee during the course of the year. Ms. Nobley probably has not taken a seat, but she is essential in the background. She's been doing a tremendous amount of work. If she's here, let's give her a round of applause. Even if she's not, maybe she'll hear us in the next room. And yes, Juliana, there is a pitcher of water underneath here. And lastly, I just want to say thanks very much to Eric and Juliana. Eric last year, I knew he had real leadership chops when former Prime Minister Paul Martin asked if there was a volunteer from the audience to come up and try and give a rationale why Canada should go into a free trade deal with Europe and the impact that it would have on the dairy producers in particular. And Eric actually came up at the spur of the moment. I'm not quite sure he knew exactly what he was getting into, but he came up and made a speech to the dairy producers. Apparently it was very effective, because we now have a free trade deal with Europe. I'm not sure it's all been fully ratified, but maybe the politicians were listening to him. Both he and Juliana have done a fantastic job this year. I have to tell you, they are young people who take responsibility for what they set out to do. They can be counted upon at all times. They manage themselves exceptionally well. I watch both of them in interactions with trying to get speakers, in interactions with their peers. They are exceptional leaders, and I'd like them to come to the podium at this point in time to introduce our keynote speaker. So Eric and Juliana, please come on up.
Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à la conférence Destiny Québec 2014. Nous sommes très heureux de vous avoir ici aujourd'hui. This year has been filled with headlines, many of which are related to the phenomenon of globalization. The Kenya Mall attack, human rights violations in Russia, and the development of a free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union are only a few examples of the impact that globalization has on our world.
As a committee, we felt that the topic of globalization and whether or not it's going too far is a very pertinent issue in our lives as young adults, because it's really all around us. We'd like to thank the Executive Committee, Mr. Piotto and Ms. Leader. Without them, this conference wouldn't be possible. We'd also like to express our sincerest gratitude to all the speakers that took the time out of their busy schedules to come and speak at this conference, and to you, all the delegates who make organizing this conference worthwhile. Finalement, nous voulons remercier M. Tellier, qui nous a gracieusement donné son temps à mieux comprendre les effets de la mondialisation.
As a man who served as clerk of the Privy Council, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian National Railway, and President of Bombardier, we are very honored to have him as our keynote speaker today. So without further ado, please welcome Mr. Paul Tellier.
Good morning to all of you, and thank you for the invitation. I really enjoy getting engaged in a dialogue with students, and therefore I'm looking forward to the next while. I am not, Patrick suggested that I speak up to 40 minutes. I am not going to speak 40 minutes. Relax. The reason being that, as I've just said, I want this to be a dialogue. So maybe I could ask one of you, after 20 minutes, please give me a shout. And after 30 minutes, if I'm still talking, please let me know. I'm serious. So I'm expecting one of you to let me know after 20 minutes. What I intend to do is basically, first of all, start with the definition. What is globalization? Then say a few words about the different aspects of globalization, and then give you very concrete real-life examples that I live with on a day in and day out as a business person, very concrete examples. And if we have time, the pros and cons of globalization, and if I don't have time, make sure that we discuss this in the question period. So what is it? To keep it simple, in a few words, it's the gradual elimination of national boundaries. If you want it a bit more complicated, it's basically the integration of economies, of industries, of people, of culture, of governance. You could ask, when did this start? Well, we're all aware that, at the beginning, way back, people were communicating within their tribes, within their villages. Then it expanded to what became cities. Cities expanded. Just think of Venice, which ruled the whole world at one point in time before becoming part of Italy. And now it's basically the integration of the various countries worldwide. The trend has always been there, but the trend, for a great many reasons, and we can get into this, the trend has started to accelerate, in the 1980s. And it has been going faster and faster ever since. So that's the definition. The different aspects, one of the most visible is the integration of economies. And before getting into the various aspects, let's take a very concrete example. Ukraine. Mr. Putin decides to annex part of Ukraine, which is called Crimea. His argument is that he wants to protect the Russian-speaking minorities in Crimea. That's basically a local issue. But the West, led by President Obama, Germany, the other key members of the Economic Union, decide that they've got to react. And therefore, first of all, they limit, they eliminate the visas for a certain number of people, those who are surrounding President Putin. They freeze their assets. So many of these people who have made a lot of money as a result of privatizations in Russia have decided to put their money in assets in London and elsewhere. These assets are frozen, and so on. So therefore, what has started, with a very local issue has now a major consequence. And then some in the Western world wants to go further with these sanctions. But they say, let's be careful. Because 35% of oil going to Germany is coming from Russia. And Germany, as you know, is the economic power, at the center of the economic power of the economic union. 36% of natural gas in Western Europe is coming from Russia. As a result of this, there is an impact on the stock market in New York. We're a long way from Crimea. But people are saying, if this guy was going to turn off the tap on natural gas, it would have quite an impact on Germany, and what would happen to economic recovery in Europe, and so on and so forth. So you see, this is, when you look at the newspapers or when you look at on your iPad or your computer at Ukraine, that's an example. You've got to connect the dots, and that's an example of globalization. So I go back to the various aspects. The economies are more and more integrated. Military, in the news today, there is a new leader taking over as Secretary General of NATO. What is NATO? Following the Second World War, the major countries of Europe decided to form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so that the treaty says if one of us being attacked by a neighbor, the others will come in and will protect us, and so on. You've got here on this continent NORAD, which is an alliance between the North American countries, of the same type, and so on and so forth. So therefore, there are some globalization in terms of the economies, national economies, in terms of the military. I've just given you a couple of examples, and so on. Politically, the economic union is the best example. The economic union has been evolving. A couple of people in Europe in 1956 said, maybe, we should trade among ourselves. We should reduce the barrier that exists against trade in the various countries, and so on. And they started, with steel and coal. And that was at the beginning. And then it started to move to other products, to other countries. It became the common market, 7 members. The common market was extended to 12 and 13. And today, it's, depending at what day of the year you're talking about, it's 28, 29. So therefore, the integration, globalization, economic, very important. Then you've got the military. You've got the what I have just said in terms of political integration. And you have also migration. For instance, one of the most recent members admitted into the economic union is Bulgaria. As a result of the economic union, joining the economic union, within the economic union, there is free movement of people. So since January 1, the citizens of Bulgaria can work anywhere in the rest of the economic union. So if you go in a restaurant today or in an hotel in London, the likelihood that there will be, Mr. Principal, you were there recently on business, you come into contact, with a Bulgarian to the same extent that the Poles, when Poland joined the economic union, started to come. So let's move to very concrete examples. And as I've said, example that I deal with, day in, day out. I sit on the board of McCain Foods. It's the largest producer of French fries in the world. couple of guys started in 1956 a small business in all places, Florenceville, New Brunswick. I'll bet you there is nobody in this room who can put this down on a map. They invested $100,000. Today, this is an $8 or $9 billion business worldwide. Why? Well, McCain started by growing potatoes in New Brunswick, next door in PEI, and to export this, across the country. And at one point in time, they said, well, maybe we should build factories also in Manitoba and elsewhere. And then they started doing the same thing across the border. And they said, maybe, we should, build factories in the U.S. And where are the regions which are the most conducive to growing potatoes? Well, it's the Pacific Northwest, states like Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and so on and so forth. So build factories there and so on and so forth. They became a very significant player in the North American market. They decided to expand to Europe. And as a result, instead of exporting to Europe, at one point in time, because very often a country put a barrier, a tariff, in order to protect its own industry domestically. So therefore, in order to overcome these tariffs, because if it's a tariff of 15%, and if you export in a country where there is a tariff of 15%, as soon as your product arrives in that country, the price of your product is 15% higher than the others. So they decided to expand. Then comes in McDonald's. And McDonald's has decided, to expand around the world. McCain, we provide more than 40% of the French fries that you eat in McDonald's wherever you eat them in the world. So McDonald's decided to expand in China and open hundreds of stores in China. And they say, McCain, we're not going to buy your potatoes from Canada. We're not going to buy your potatoes from Holland or from France. We want you to build a plan in China because we want to be able to tell the Chinese that we are a China-based organization, and therefore we want from now on to buy from you a product which is a local product. So you have that firm, with a headquarters in Florenceville, New Brunswick, building a plant in Harbin, 800 miles north of Beijing, in order to supply McDonald's. McDonald's is expanding big time in Russia. They want us to build, a plant there, for the same reason. So that's globalization. There is a very local firm that has expanded and so on and so forth based on trade, on tariff policy, fiscal policy, and so on. Another example, Rio Tinto. Also sit on that board. Rio Tinto is the third largest mining group in the world. What do we produce? Iron ore, copper, diamonds, aluminum, bauxite, obviously, coal, uranium, and so on. And as a result of deposits having been exploited in the industrialized world to a large extent, a company like Rio has to expand and do exploration and development further away from the OECD countries, the industrialized world. So today, where are the biggest projects of Rio Tinto? And for instance, Rio Tinto is the owner here in Canada. We have 13,000 employees. We own Iron Ore of Canada. We bought Alcan, and so on and so forth. But we've got to expand beyond that. So our biggest project at this point in time, Mongolia. Where's Mongolia? North of Russia, of China, and east of Russia. Guinea in Africa. In Mongolia, it's a copper mine that we're developing. In Guinea, it's an iron ore mine. Mozambique, also in Africa, that's coal, and so on and so forth. Where is the globalization dimension to this? Well, when you invest 10 or 12 or 15 billion dollars in a copper mine in Mongolia, the impact on that country, it's huge. When that mine will be fully operational, 33% of the GDP of that country will be coming from the production of Rio Tinto. And if you are going to have one of the largest copper mines in the world, you need employees. And of course, if you were the national government of Mongolia, you're going to say, all right, to get this started, you can start with so-called expats, people from other countries coming in to assist in the development of the mine. But we want jobs for Mongolians. And therefore, you've got to train Mongolians. Well, guess what? As I was saying, Mr. Piotto, when we had a chat about this DG conference, the biggest training institute at this point in time in Mongolia is a Rio Tinto Institute. We are currently training more than 3,000 Mongolians, to be able to provide them with the skills required to work in that big project, which is going to have such an impact, on the GDP of Mongolia. But the story does not stop there. Rio Tinto has a huge copper mine in Utah, near Salt Lake City. Very close to where the Olympics, the last one of the Winter Olympics took place recently. We were visiting that mine, Kennecott Copper, in September. And what do I see there? 20, 30, 40 Mongolians, young people, their early 20s. What are they doing there? Well, they go to our training school, in Mongolia, in Ulaanbaatar, in the capital of Mongolia. But to get real life experience, we transfer them to Utah, where they will get, the real life experience. So that's another example of a very concrete indication of the evolution of globalization. So Mongolia today is no longer, an isolated country. You will recall that way back, there was an empire, a Mongolian empire, and so on and so forth. But now it's rather small country squeezed between Russia and China, and so on. But now they will become a major, as a result of investments of that nature, a major player in one of the key commodities, copper. Another example, and I have reached 20 minutes. 20? 20? 2 more minutes to 20. Okay. The next one I would give is Bombardier. As you know, Bombardier is headquartered in Montreal. Bombardier has created about 20,000 jobs right here. Bombardier is in 2 businesses. They used to be in 3. They used to be in recreational product like Sea-Doos and Ski-Doos and so on. But, we sold this in my days to pay down debt. And now they are involved in aerospace, making business jets and commercial aircraft. For instance, those who fly to Toronto Island, that's a Bombardier, the Q400 that all these planes, whether it's Air Canada or Porter, all these planes are Bombardier made. Well, if you look at the planes that Bombardier is making, it's a perfect example of globalization. Very often, the wing of a plane is made by Mitsubishi. Where? In Japan. Very often, the electronics will come from other parts of Asia. Could be Korea. Very often, the fuselage will come from Shorts Brothers, one of the first builders of aircraft. By the way, you're aware of the Wright brothers, who were the first people to fly, two Americans. Their plane was made by Short Brothers in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. And Bombardier is the largest employer, the largest private employer, of people in Northern Ireland out of Belfast. 6,000 or 7,000 people, in that shop, in that factory, and so on. If you look at the other side of Bombardier, Bombardier over the years, starting with the Metro of Montreal, has become the largest manufacturer of rail equipment, anything that moves on rail. Tramways, commuter trains, high-speed trains, locomotives, you name it, subway car, Bombardier Transportation produced this. The headquarters of Bombardier Transportation, and we can get into why in a minute in the question and answer period, the headquarters is in Berlin, Germany. When you get from the customer the specs, the specifications to build either a tramway for the city of Vienna or a subway car, for any city, these specs have to be converted into 3 dimensions. And of course, more and more today is being done by computers. But a great deal of this is being done also, by engineers or technical people translating the specifications to the degree of specificity that is required. Well, instead of using an engineer at 30 euros, or if you prefer, the equivalent of about $40 an hour in Berlin or elsewhere in Germany or elsewhere in Europe, many of these plans, of these specs, are outsourced, quote unquote, and the business is transferred to India. And there to be made at $8 an hour. So I've shared with you my definition, a classic definition of what is globalization. The word comes from global. I've mentioned the various aspects. I've mentioned some very concrete examples. So, any question before we get into the pros and cons? Over to you.
With globalization, everything being interconnected, what happens if an economy is depending on another economy and everything crashes? What happens then when there's an economic downfall?
You're raising a very good question. There is a long list of pros and cons. There is a long list of pros and cons in globalization. And in terms of the disadvantages, is that the example I've just given is a good one, is that temporarily it could create unemployment in some sector. So for instance, in the case of Germany, it's a high growth area and so on and so forth. The fact that some jobs are being outsourced to India doesn't have a major impact. But, you know, it is obviously a problem. Secondly, directly related to this, based on your question, national governments have less control of their economy because more and more it is integrated. So, for instance, Chancellor Merkel in Germany is being very careful how she reacts to the situation in Ukraine and in Russia, because I have said, you know, her country is dependent to a large extent in terms of energy on Russia. So it's obviously one of the downsides.
Thank you.
Before we continue with the questions, we just want to give another round of applause for Mr. Tellier for the excellent keynote speech. And we have a little gift to offer our appreciation for him coming and speaking to us today. So once again, thanks.
So you spoke about Crimea a little bit and how it influenced the whole global economy and the New York Stock Exchange and all that. But now that we're putting sanctions on Russia, which is a much bigger country with a much more valuable economy to the whole world, and like you also spoke about the resource dependency that Europe has, Germany more than any other country, for Russia's natural gas and oil. And well, you see companies like Gazprom in Germany, and that's probably why Angela Merkel is so reluctant to really make any decisions. But with the sanctions that we're putting onto Russia right now, are they really that strong? Can they really affect Russia that much if we depend on them so much for resources? And even if we do put them into place, do you think that it'll harm our economies more than theirs because we depend on them so much for certain things?
Yes. On the short term, this is why the quote-unquote Western world has been so prudent and cautious. And, you know, when they came out, you know, with these restrictions on visas for about 20 people, some people were laughing at this and saying, you know, I mean, be serious. I mean, come on, you know, who cares? And what have you. But it will force some major readjustment. For instance, it is quite possible that Europe could become energy sufficient very rapidly. It's a question of redeploying. Most of the pipelines, both for oil and gas, are reversible. It is quite possible short terms, you know, to become independent. And then you may be aware that there is a limitation on the export of natural gas out of the U.S. Well, in terms of you know, deep gas, you know, this fractioning and so on and so forth, that is happening. The U.S. now is becoming energy independent and so on, and there is a strong movement in the U.S. that the restriction to export natural gas through LNGs or otherwise, you know, should take place and so on and so forth. So, you know, this could displace. So, yeah, there is a real danger of affecting the feeble recovery of the countries within the economic union, and the closer they are to the Russian border, the more likely it is. But it's the price that one has to pay to say to Mr. Putin, is enough, because Crimea is one thing, but, you know, I, for one, I don't admire him, but I think that he is a very good chess player, extremely good. He's a very good strategist. He's one of the strongest at this point in time on the world stage, and you've got to ask yourself, what is he going to do next? And what is he trying to do is basically, he was brought up, you know, in the KGB, where it was the Soviet Union. And with the, you know, the Berlin Wall falling, all these countries, you know, that the Soviets, you know, that Russia had dominated became independent, you know, and so on. So the Western world is worried that Moldova, for instance, could be the next one, because there is also a Russian-speaking minority in that country, and it goes go on and on. So, but you're perfectly right. These sanctions are not risk-free for us.
Okay, thank you.
So you spoke about Mongolia and how Rio Tinto kind of expanded there. Well, could you speak more a bit about how it affects the local businesses in Mongolia or businesses in Africa and so on?
Well, it is a company like Rio Tinto has interest to make sure that they assist in the development of local businesses. And therefore, they assist in terms of training small and medium-sized enterprises, growing up, expanding, and so on and so forth. So we are a long way from the colonial days where, France or Britain or Belgium or the Dutch would just move in and take over a country. Now you require, far more sensitivity. Our chairman said recently publicly, yeah, we are a mining group, but you know what? You don't need a geologist to run this. We need somebody who has political sensitivity and so on, who can, relate to a foreign government in another language, in another culture, and so on and so forth. Let's keep in mind that in Mongolia, outside of Ulaanbaatar, a great many people still ride, camels. So, this is very, very different than an iron ore mine, on the Quebec North Shore. So therefore, I think that the reaction overall is positive. But again, to follow on the pros and cons, there is a danger that they may lose their culture, they may become too Americanized, quote unquote, too much Western world, and what have you. Or another danger, as it happened in some countries, for instance, South Africa is a good example, is that the ruling class become awfully rich. I was in South Africa, some months ago and so on and so forth. I was a great fan of Mandela, by the way. Read his biography. This is one of the greatest books, And Mandela left, but basically, black power has not taken over, a limited amount of the black population has become just as rich as the white population was. But, the gap between the haves and the have-nots have not been bridged. So, thank you. Very good questions, guys.
We've seen a lot of technological unification in our world, and now there's a lot of organizations like Bitcoin that are trying to make an online global currency. Do you think this is the future of globalization?
I would say I hope not. In terms of financial instruments, I tend to be very conservative and very cautious, and Bitcoin is an internet currency. I was looking recently. In terms of the worst investment that you could make in the first 3 months of this year, Bitcoin is way at the top. I'm looking for the right word. It's not a real currency. They are trying to create a new currency. There are a lot of people who are betting on currencies. The short sellers, they bet that, a currency will go down and so on and so forth. So I don't believe in this. It does not create wealth for a certain number of people. It's like, the financial engineering that is done by some people. There are some schemes and so on. I belong very much to the school of thought. I support, I'm a great fan of Warren Buffett. Don't invest in what you don't understand, and don't invest in fads. As Warren Buffett says, Gillett, and the razor blades, they've been here for a while, and they will continue to be here for a while. So I tend to be quite negative about something like Bitcoin. Are they going to succeed? They are in the right places and so on and so forth. The technology, this has been going on. Now it's a front line. It's a front page headline. But this thing, started in 2009 and 2010 and so on. But now you've got these exchanges and so on. I don't know. I'm very skeptical.
Thank you.
How do you think globalization has contributed to income inequality? Like, you talked a lot about outsourcing, but how do you think that has made the gap between the rich and the poor greater?
Globally, worldwide, I think so. But again, I can show the pros and cons. Loblaws. As you know, Loblaws decided to go into clothing. So now you can buy a pair of jeans, at the Loblaw store, supermarket. Loblaws decided that their jeans, in order to be competitive, would not be made here, but they would get a lower price. Where? In Bangladesh. Well, you saw the headlines. There were people working, like slaves, but more importantly, without trade unions and so on protecting them, but more importantly, the working conditions. So the building collapsed. I don't remember how many hundreds of people suffered and so on and so forth. So therefore, on the one end, as a result of giving that contract, Loblaws has created jobs in Bangladesh. And factories still exist producing jeans, and therefore these people are not on the street. They have a job, and they work, and they can support their family and so on and so forth. And believe me, I was in Bangladesh, and I visited an hospital in Bangladesh some years ago. This is one of the most troubling situations that I've seen in my life, with flies, flying over people who just went to surgery and so on and so forth. It was just god awful. So they need help. On the other end, they were exploited. Galen Weston came out right away. Took 36 hours, he was in the news, and saying, yeah, we're buying jeans, from a contractor in Bangladesh. These situations are unacceptable. We don't want the people involved in our product to be exploited, and so on and so forth. And he said, Loblaws, from now on, is going to have a supervisor right there in the field, supervising the working condition. So you see the pros and cons?
Thank you.
Do you believe that globalization in terms of huge multinational corporations coming in is probably harmful to the owners of smaller scale businesses? And if so, what do you think the future holds for smaller scale companies?
Well, you're aware that in North America, job creation comes first and foremost from the small and medium-sized firms at this point in time. So therefore, I think that there is a future. The large corporations forces the smaller one to be competitive. And I'm a strong believer in competition. And, you're aware, by association in this school, look at Saputo, what they have done. This is unbelievable. This is just unbelievable. I was in Australia, a few months ago. Saputo is expanding, and it's a front page story, they are trying to acquire a firm. I don't know if it has been done yet, and so on and so forth. Another story in this school that you're aware of, Gildan, the t-shirt. I mean, this is an amazing story. Just amazing. Become the largest. So this started here, and they had to move out and add their t-shirts, in many cases, produce abroad, and so on and so forth. So the basic of economics, and I think, Patrick, in the seminars later on, with a smaller group, we're going to get into this. But in terms of economics, if you produce something, you've got to find ways to produce it at the lower possible cost. And I think that globalization in that sense is a very positive factor. In the case of the free trade agreement, that was referred to earlier with Korea, the government was criticized because the cheese producers are saying we're going to be affected. Yes, the milk producers and so on and so forth, but this industry is highly protected. And if they were no longer protected, you and I, when we buy a liter of milk, we're paying less than we're paying today. So overall, I think it's good, and Saputo will have to buy less cheese, in the U.S., and we'll be able to get more cheese here, and so on and so forth. Overall, I think it would be very, very good. So I'm a free trader, and I believe that it's very beneficial.
With Germany being so dependent on Russia with respect to the economy and natural gas, do you think it would be in their best interest to stay out of the whole Russia and Ukraine situation?
It depends, Do you believe in human rights? Do you believe in the integrity of territorial sovereignty? There was a war, in the last century about Crimea. And it's very nice. Putin is a very impressive guy, and he wants to try to recreate through the back door the Soviet Union. Are we in the Western world, are we ready to let him do it? So therefore, where do you draw the line? So, I'm very glad I'm not the Chancellor of Germany. She's got tough choices to make and so on and so forth. So it's a very good point that you're making.
Thank you.
So Tellier, I'm just going to say we probably have time for about 2 or 3 more questions. And I see we've got a visitor from LCC. I'd like you to get a chance because most of the questions have come from LCC students. So why don't you take first in front of Charles?
Ah, you're jumping the queue, eh?
Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so my question's kind of similar to Phil's question about outsourcing, but I was just wondering a bit about the balance in terms of where we want to draw, like having jobs in our countries and having jobs in other countries, having a more globalized market and competitive market, or the exploitation of workers, and where do you think that balance is?
Well, let's use the example of, I suppose I don't know their business, well, but let's take the example of Gildan because, many of you are familiar with this. We are a small market, 35 million people. Within this market, we can grow only so much. After that, we've got to export. And if we export to other countries, and these countries have tariffs, they impose a tax when the products arrive at the border, the product that comes from here cannot compete. So therefore, if we have these free trade arrangements, these tariffs disappear. And therefore, there is a chance to produce a product here and to be competitive on world markets to some extent and so on. But I think that overall, the effect is positive. But, the world is not black and white, it's always gray. And when Mr. Mulroney in 1988 fought an election on a free trade agreement with the US, it was a very controversial issue. Today, as a business person, I look at the situation. If we didn't have today the free trade agreement or NAFTA, because Mexico was brought in, with Canada, I think that the economy of Canada would be in very, very dire straits.
Maybe I'm just a little bit confused, but on the topic of...
I apologize. I did try to be clear.
But on the top...
But you know, it's a complex subject, so don't worry if you are confused.
But on the topic of taking the $40 job in Germany versus the $8 job in India, doesn't the concept of globalization go against that because you're getting a more global economy? So technically, you wouldn't really be helping the economy as much by taking the $8 job versus the $40 job?
Well, if you were taking the $40 job in Germany, you would help the German economy, no doubt about that. But keep in mind that the objective is to sell a subway car or a tramway, and you've got competitors across the street, you know, like Siemens or Alstom, you know, who are going to find ways to produce that tramway you know, cheaper. And therefore, if their blueprints are converted in a country where, you know, the currency is not as strong or the standard of living is lower, they're going to beat you. And when you quote, you know, for the metro of Kuala Lumpur, you made a bid, you know, to provide them with new subway cars. You know, Siemens is going to come in, you know, with a lower price, and you're going to lose the contract. And as a result, these $40, the €40 job in Germany are going to disappear.
I see, thank you.